Snow is quiet in a way that unnerves the human mind. It does not crash like thunder. It does not scream like the wind. It does not announce itself with fire or ash. It arrives in silence, a slow and patient burial that drowns the world in stillness. A white shroud, heavy and merciless, that falls without pause until even the strongest among us begin to feel small beneath it. For centuries, people have said that snow is beautiful, that it covers the earth like purity, like innocence. But purity is a lie, and innocence is a mask. The truth is that snow is a predator. Its beauty lures, its silence conceals, and its cold strips the flesh from the soul. There are far too many graves hidden beneath winter's silence, and many of them were never meant to be graves at all. It is said that bodies freeze faster than memories. A man collapses in the snow, his breath cut short, his pulse slowing, and within hours his body is preserved as if time itself stepped aside. His face, his eyes, the moment of fear or agony in which he fell, remain untouched for months. The snow will not decay him. It will not allow the earth to reclaim him. It will hold him in place, his last expression locked in ice until spring comes to reveal him. Families find their lost ones this way. Faces staring up from the thaw, eyes glassy, skin pale blue, caught forever in the moment of death. There are those who believe the snow does not preserve the dead but traps them, that it holds them not for nature but for something else, something patient, something that waits for the thaw as much as it waits for us. Every winter, stories emerge, stories of travelers who vanished in the storm, their belongings found scattered as though torn from them by invisible hands, stories of villages cut off from the world, their silence broken only when searchers finally arrive and discover empty homes, meals still on the table, doors left ajar as though the occupants fled mid-breath. There are accounts of entire families found lifeless in their cabins. No sign of violence, no tracks in or out, only frost creeping across their skin as though they had all exhaled for the last time together. And there is one story, passed from lips to ears, generation to generation, whispered most often on nights like this, when the wind is low and the snow falls heavy, when the fire seems too small to keep the dark away. It is the story of a winter long ago, when a group of people disappeared into the storm, never to be found whole again. Their footprints stopped in the snow, their cries carried only once before silence returned. When rescuers searched, they found fragments, shreds of fabric, the outlines of bare hands pressed against the frozen ground, and strange patterns in the drifts that looked almost like symbols carved by something other than wind. The bodies that were recovered, stiff and pale, bore expressions that suggested terror, not resignation. Not the look of those who simply froze, the look of those who saw something they should not have seen. The authorities blamed the cold. They always blame the cold: hypothermia, frostbite, starvation. The explanations are neat, easy to sign, easy to close. But there are details they do not print in the papers. Details that linger in the shadows of testimony. The searchers who claim to hear voices in the blizzard. The marks found on nearby trees, too deliberate to be natural. The way some of the victims had fled into the storm half-clothed, stripped of garments in the middle of deadly temperatures. It is called paradoxical undressing, a known effect of hypothermia, but there is no medical term that explains the claw-like gouges in the ice, or the way the snow seemed to fall harder around the site, as if to bury it quicker. Those who lived in the region did not accept the reports. They did not believe it was simple. They spoke, instead of the winter taking what it wanted, of figures that appear in the distance when the snow is thick, standing still, watching. Figures that vanish when approached, leaving behind only prints too deep, too wide, too wrong for any human shape. Some said it was the land reclaiming lives, old spirits that dwell where the sun cannot break the clouds. Others said it was madness, the isolation of endless winter nights. Yet even now, travelers speak of unease when crossing certain valleys, as if the snow remembers, as if it hungers still. And so the question lingers like the cold itself. What happened on that night, when lives were swallowed by the storm, when the white silence covered every trace? Were they victims of nature, of the merciless hand of winter? Or was there something older, something waiting, hidden behind the curtain of falling snow? It is easy to dismiss the story as legend, easy to say the cold plays tricks, that the human mind crumbles in the face of endless frost. But legends do not leave bodies frozen in contorted shapes, mouths open as though screaming. Legends do not leave claw marks in ice, nor do they strip the sky of sound. Legends do not make entire groups vanish, leaving nothing but scattered belongings and a silence that endures for decades. The snow falls tonight as it did then. Silent, endless, suffocating, Somewhere beneath it, perhaps, are answers. Or perhaps there are only more graves. Tell me this. When you hear the wind rise outside your window, when you see the flakes fall against the glass, do you feel comfort, or do you feel watched? There is a valley far to the north, where the winters are longer than the summers, where the sun itself seems reluctant to rise. Generations of people once lived there, carving out lives with their hands, relying on the forest, the frozen rivers, and the animals that moved in herds across the snowfields. The place was quiet, almost forgotten by the outside world. But those who called it home did not see themselves as forgotten. They were bound to the land by blood and memory. Every path through the woods was known. Every bend in the frozen stream carried a name. Yet beneath that familiarity there was an unspoken weight, a silence that hung heavy even when laughter filled the cabins. People knew what the winters meant. They knew how quickly life could vanish once the storms came. And they told stories in low voices about what waited in the snow. The valley was marked by seasons of hardship. The soil was stubborn, the forests thick and unforgiving. The cold tested every person who remained there. Families passed down survival skills the way others passed down heirlooms. How to find shelter in the timber when a storm fell too sudden. How to read the animal tracks when food grew scarce. How to tell by the crack of ice whether a river would hold or break beneath your feet. It was a way of life shaped by caution, respect, and fear. Outsiders who visited often remarked on how quiet the villagers were, how their eyes seemed always to drift toward the mountains, as if expecting something to come down from them. Every winter there were whispers of tragedies. A hunter who did not return from the ridge. A child lost on the short walk between cabins, found hours later stiff beneath the drifts. A family whose firewood ran low, who froze together inside their home, embraced as though trying to hold the warmth in one another. These stories became a kind of inheritance repeated year after year, not only as warnings but as reminders that the valley took what it wished. Yet in time the people learned to live with it. They said that if you respected the snow, if you did not wander, if you kept the fire burning, you would survive. Still, not all listened, and not all returned. It was in this valley, in a winter remembered for its ferocity, that a group of travelers arrived. They were not strangers to hardship. They had come from nearby settlements, carrying with them supplies, sleds, and a determination to cross the mountain pass before the storms grew worse. Some said they were traders. Others believed they were moving their families, hoping to find a better life on the other side of the range. What is certain is that they were warned. The villagers told them plainly. The pass was unpredictable, the winds merciless, the storms sudden. They told them of those who had tried before and never returned. The travelers listened politely, but determination is its own blindness. They pressed on, believing preparation would keep them safe. The village watched them leave, their sleds heavy, their boots sinking into the drifts. The figures grew smaller until they vanished behind the line of trees, the sound of their dogs muffled by falling snow. Some villagers shook their heads. Others crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Winter had taught them not to interfere with those who would not listen. And yet there was unease. The storm clouds had already begun to gather. As the travelers made their way higher into the mountains, the weather turned against them. At first it was only a light snowfall, the kind that dusts the hair and stiffens the clothing. Then the wind rose, the flakes thickened, and soon the sky itself seemed to collapse. The snow fell in sheets, erasing the trail behind them, smothering sound, turning every direction into the same endless white. Men shouted, their voices carried away. The dogs strained, their paws vanishing into drifts that seemed to grow faster than they could move. When they tried to rest, the cold pushed against them, seeping through their layers, biting at the skin beneath. They lit fires, but the flames guttered in the wind. Meanwhile, in the valley, the storm raged for days. Windows rattled in their frames, roofs groaned beneath the weight. The villagers stayed close to their fires, telling themselves that the travelers must have found shelter, though many knew it was a lie. The mountain did not forgive arrogance. The mountain did not grant safety to those who thought they could command it. When the storm broke, the village waited. Days passed. No one returned. No voices carried down from the pass. Finally, a search party gathered. They moved into the forest, past the familiar line of trees, onto the trails that wound upward into the ridges. The snow was deep, the air still. The silence so complete it pressed against the ears. Hours into the journey, they found the first sign, a scrap of cloth snagged on a branch, frozen stiff. Then further on, a half-buried sled, its contents spilled as though ripped away by unseen hands. And then, the tracks, footprints that began neatly in line but grew erratic, some veering off into the trees, others circling back as if the people themselves had turned against one another. The villagers followed the tracks with unease, but they did not speak. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before, though never on this scale. The footprints led them into a clearing where the snow was disturbed, marked with impressions that no one could explain. Some said they looked like hands pressed too wide with too many fingers. Others swore they were not prints at all, but shapes left by the wind itself, though none had ever seen wind move like that. There were no bodies, not yet. Only silence, and the unsettling knowledge that the mountain had claimed more. The valley would carry the story for generations. Parents would tell their children never to stray too far, never to test the snow, never to forget that the storm takes. And always in the background of those warnings, there lingered the memory of the travelers who did not return. Their names were lost to time, but their absence was not. And so the land held them, the snow covering every trace until it seemed as though they had never existed at all. Yet those who lived in the valley knew better. They knew the silence of winter does not erase, it keeps. The storm that swallowed the travelers should have been the end of their story. Most in the valley believed as much. A blizzard that fierce leaves nothing behind except snowdrifts and silence. But what followed unsettled even those who thought they had already seen all that winter could do. In the days after the storm, the air grew eerily calm. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray as though drained of color, and the snow lay heavy across the land. The searchers, those who braved the pass, expected to find what storms usually leave: collapsed shelters, broken sleds, and the still forms of those who had surrendered to the cold. But what they found instead was confusion. The first signs appeared along the lower ridges, a trail of footprints half-buried, weaving erratically as though the people had scattered in panic. Some prints showed boots, others the naked impression of bare feet. In temperatures that could freeze skin in minutes, this detail gnawed at the mind. Further along, more strange discoveries emerged. A leather satchel lying open in the snow, its contents spilled out as though dropped mid-step. A lantern extinguished, its glass unbroken. Shreds of clothing clung to branches far from the trail, torn and fluttering faintly in the wind. The deeper they went, the less sense it made. Why had the travelers abandoned their sleds? Why had some left their clothing behind? Why were there no animals, no birds, not even the faint trace of a hare darting across the drifts? It was as if the mountain had emptied itself of all life. Then came the first body, a man half buried in the snow. His face turned upward, mouth frozen open in a scream that would never fade. His hands were raw, the skin torn as if he had clawed desperately at the ice beneath him. Around his body the snow was disturbed, not in any way that suggested a fight with another person, but in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The searchers avoided speaking of it, though some whispered that the marks resembled symbols, spirals carved into the drifts. Not far from him lay another, a woman curled on her side, her body stiff, her hair matted with ice. Her boots were missing, though her feet were bare and bloodied, cut open by the frozen crust. Beside her lay a fragment of wood, a broken branch sharpened to a point. It looked as though she had fashioned it into a weapon, though what she meant to fight in the middle of a snowstorm no one could say. The searchers pressed on, following the trail of chaos higher into the pass. They expected to find more bodies, and they did. But each was stranger than the last. Some were discovered lying side by side as if they had collapsed together. Others were found alone, their tracks leading them into the trees far from the group as though fleeing something unseen. One body was discovered in a small hollow beneath an overhang, crouched as though hiding. His eyes were frozen open, his face twisted in a grimace of terror. And then came the footprints. Not human this time. Impressions pressed deep into the snow, wider than a man's, longer than any known animal. Some seemed almost like hands, though the proportions were wrong. Too long in the fingers, too heavy at the palm. They trailed alongside the human prints for some distance before veering off into the forest, vanishing into shadows that the searchers dared not follow. The strangest detail, however, was the silence. Even in the aftermath of storms, the mountains usually stirred back to life. Birds returned. The wind moved branches. Streams cracked and groaned beneath their ice. But here there was nothing. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the faint rasp of breath. The searchers described it later as if the world itself was holding its breath, as if sound had been stolen from the air. Days turned into weeks as more of the travelers were found. The further they searched, the stranger the patterns became. Some bodies bore no sign of struggle, simply frozen where they lay as if they had sat down and given up. Others had injuries that no one could explain, fractures without cause, torn skin without blood. One body was found in a tree, suspended several feet off the ground as if placed there. Snow had gathered on his limbs, his eyes wide open, staring at the valley below. When the searchers returned with what they could carry, the village listened in silence. The details did not add up. The official explanation, whispered even then, was hypothermia, disorientation, madness born of cold. It was easier to believe than to face the alternative, yet those who had gone into the past did not sleep well after. They woke in the night to the sound of wind that carried voices, though no one was outside. They dreamed of white figures standing at the edge of the trees. They felt watched when they walked alone, even on clear days. And still there were unanswered questions. Why had so many fled without shoes or coats? Why had they abandoned their supplies when survival depended on them? Why were there markings in the snow that no storm could make? And footprints too deep, too wrong to belong to any human being? The storm had taken them, yes. That much was true. But storms do not carve symbols. Storms do not drag bodies into trees. Storms do not leave silence so thick it feels alive. The villagers tried to bury the story. They told themselves not to speak of the travelers again. But the valley does not forget. Snow covers, snow silences, but snow remembers. And every winter after, when the first storms fell heavy and the fires burned late into the night, people looked to the mountains and wondered, what really waits out there when the sky goes white? The valley kept fragments of the tragedy like a wound that refused to close. Not all of the bodies were recovered. Some lay too far in the past beneath layers of ice that could not be broken without risking lives. Others vanished entirely, their footprints ending mid-step in fields of unbroken snow. But what was brought back to the village was enough to stain memory. The cabins where the bodies were laid became places of dread, their air heavy with frost and silence. Those who dared to examine the remains reported details that no one could easily explain, though official words later smoothed them into something less threatening. The first clues came from the clothing. Many of the dead had stripped themselves in the middle of freezing temperatures, leaving coats, boots, and gloves behind. At first it was called paradoxical undressing, a strange reaction of the body in the final stages of hypothermia. Doctors explained that as the nerves froze, victims felt a burning heat, tearing away their protection as though trying to cool themselves. But this did not explain everything. Some of the clothing was found torn, seams ripped apart not by careful hands but by frantic force. Threads were pulled loose as if wrenched away in struggle, and in a few cases there were no garments nearby at all, as though the items had vanished with their owners. Next were the injuries. Several bodies bore strange marks, fractures in the ribs, splits in the skin. Yet there were no signs of falls, no cliffs nearby to explain such force. One man had a broken skull, but the snow beneath him was undisturbed, no blood, no sign of impact. Another had bruises along her arms in the shape of fingers too large to be human. Officials suggested the weight of snow could crush a body that way, but the villagers who saw the bruises shook their heads. The marks looked deliberate, grasping, holding. There were also the scratches. Across patches of ice, grooves were etched as though desperate hands had clawed the surface. Fingernails were torn from some of the victims, blood frozen in thin trails. But in certain places, the scratches went deeper, wider, like something with strength beyond human had dragged along the ice. The searchers whispered that some of the patterns almost resembled symbols, spirals, crooked crosses, interlocking lines that repeated again and again. No one could say if the travelers had made them in delirium or if they had been carved by something else. Among the belongings recovered, one item stood out. A journal, its leather cover stiff with frost, its pages blurred but not destroyed. The writing inside was uneven, lines trailing off as though the hand that held the pencil grew weak. The early entries described the journey in simple detail, the weight of the sleds, the cold of the nights, the hope that the pass could be crossed. But as the pages turned, the words shifted. Sentences grew shorter, frantic, scattered. Mentions of shapes in the snow, of voices calling from the ridge, of a presence felt at the edge of the firelight. One entry simply read, "It is not the storm." The final words were nearly illegible, written with shaking hand. "We are being watched." Some dismissed the journal as the ramblings of a man dying in the cold. But the searchers who had stood in the clearing, who had seen the strange impressions in the snow, did not dismiss it so easily. They kept their voices low, but their silence told more than their words. Testimonies from the searchers themselves also revealed fractures in the official account. One claimed that while moving through the forest he heard laughter carried on the wind. Not the laughter of joy, but high, strained, broken, laughter that ended in a scream. Another swore he saw figures standing between the trees, pale against the dark wood, unmoving. When he blinked, they were gone. The men told themselves it was the storm playing tricks, exhaustion bending the mind. Yet they remembered it years later, the memory sharper than any dream. Experts later came from the cities, men in heavy coats who examined the remains, took measurements, and wrote their reports. They spoke of cold-induced madness, of starvation, of hallucinations brought by exhaustion. They cited scientific terms that reassured on paper, but left a hollow ache in those who had seen the bodies firsthand. Because science could not explain the eyes. Many of the dead had eyes wide open, frozen in expressions of terror so raw it seemed alive even after death. Not resignation, not peace. Terror that lingered in the ice. There were also the dogs. A few of the sled animals were found alive, though barely. They cowered when approached, their fur stiff, their bodies trembling even when given warmth. They refused to leave the corners of the cabins where they were placed, growling low at shadows, eyes fixed on something beyond human sight. One of them would not eat. It lay with its head pressed against the floorboards until it finally died. No visible wound, only silence. The artifacts, the injuries, the testimonies, each detail added weight, but none gave answers. Every explanation contradicted another. Hypothermia did not account for broken bones. Hallucinations did not place bodies in trees. Storms did not carve symbols. Yet no one could say what else it could have been. And so the story hardened into a mystery, preserved by the cold like the bodies themselves. In the valley the people carried on, but unease seeped into the air. They avoided the pass even in good weather. They taught their children never to follow footprints in the snow if they led away from home. They told them to keep the fire burning, never to walk into the white silence. And when the wind rose at night, they closed their eyes tightly because sometimes it carried whispers, faint, broken, almost human. The mountain kept its secrets. The snow covered the evidence, but what had been seen could not be unseen. When the bodies were brought back from the mountain, the valley changed. Before, the winters had always carried fear, but it was the ordinary fear of hunger, of frostbite, of losing one's way in the snow. Now there was something else, something heavier, sharper, and harder to name. The people had looked upon death many times before, but never like this. Never with faces frozen in horror. Never with wounds that did not match the world they knew. Never with marks that suggested the presence of something beyond their understanding. Families of the dead wept in silence. They gathered in the cabins, the air filled with the smell of damp wool and burning pine, and they tried to grieve. But grief requires answers. It requires a shape, a direction toward which the pain can be pointed. These families had none. They had only fragments, contradictions, and the raw fact that their loved ones had gone into the storm and had not returned as they should have. Mothers stared into the flames as though waiting for them to speak. Children clung to fathers who themselves had no words. Some relatives refused to touch the bodies at all, saying the cold still clung too strongly to them, as if the mountain had not finished with them yet. The searchers were no better. Men who had lived their lives in those woods, men hardened by years of hunting and cutting timber, now avoided the pass. They avoided even speaking of it. Some could not sleep. They woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, swearing they had heard screams beneath the howl of the wind outside. One man left the valley altogether. He told no one where he was going. He left in the middle of the night, walking down the frozen river until the snow swallowed him from sight. Children grew restless too. They heard the whispers between adults, caught fragments of words not meant for them, symbols, voices, figures. When the storms howled against the cabins, the children lay awake, convinced that something pressed against the windows, watching. They dreamed of pale faces in the snow, mouths open, eyes wide. Some refused to leave the fire's glow, trembling if asked to fetch wood from the piles stacked outside. The fear of the mountain had seeped into their bones, and it would remain there long after the winter ended. The community became quieter. Nights grew longer not only because of the season but because people stopped gathering. Where once families had visited one another, telling stories by the fire, now doors remained closed. Each cabin was its own island, sealed tight against the night. The silence that blanketed the valley was no longer only from the snow. It was chosen, as if to keep something at bay. Even the laughter of children dulled, replaced by hushed tones and cautious glances toward the windows. There were whispers of curses. Some said the land was not meant to be crossed, that the travelers had trespassed where they should not have gone. Others said the valley itself was tainted, a place marked by old blood or forgotten rites. Elders who had always laughed at superstition now held their tongues, their faces lined with worry. They did not tell the stories anymore to entertain. They told them as warnings, their voices low, their eyes never leaving the shadows. Those who had seen the worst of it suffered most. A man who had helped recover the bodies stopped speaking altogether. He sat by the fire day after day, staring into the flames as though waiting for something to emerge from them. His family tried to comfort him, but he no longer answered. One night he walked out into the snow barefoot. They found him the next morning at the edge of the forest, his body stiff, his face turned toward the mountains. Another rescuer took to drink, his hands trembling whenever the snow began to fall. He muttered constantly about the eyes, that the eyes of the dead had followed him, that even now when he tried to close his own, he saw them staring back. He claimed that in the silence between storms he could still hear the dead calling, their voices thin, echoing across the frozen ridges. His family tried to dismiss it as madness, but in the long nights, when they too heard the strange sounds carried on the wind, they did not speak against him. The valley became a place of dread. Outsiders who visited noticed it at once. The way the people avoided the past, the way they refused to answer questions about the winter tragedy. The villagers offered hospitality, but their eyes carried shadows and their words carried weight. Some visitors left quickly, unsettled by the quiet. Others stayed. And in time they too learned that the silence of the valley was not emptiness but something heavier, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Even as the thaw came, melting the snow and uncovering the earth, the unease did not lift. Usually spring brought relief, laughter, the return of color. That year it brought only more questions. When the ice melted along the ridges, more belongings surfaced. Scarves, boots, splintered wood. But no more bodies. The mountain had claimed the rest for itself. The thaw also revealed deep grooves in the bark of certain trees, marks too deliberate to be mistaken for weather. They spiraled upward as if something had clawed its way along the trunks. The valley was never the same. Families moved away in the years that followed, unwilling to remain where their loved ones had been taken. Cabins were left empty, shutters banging in the wind until the forest began to swallow them. Those who stayed carried the weight of silence like a burden, whispering warnings to their children, avoiding the pass, never letting the fires burn low. And still, the memories remained. The frozen faces, the strange wounds, the voices in the wind. No one could explain them, but no one could forget them either. Trauma lingered like frostbite, gnawing at the flesh long after the cold had passed. The valley did not heal. It adapted, it endured, but it never forgot. And in the quiet of winter nights, when the snow fell heavy and the fire crackled low, every soul in that place felt the same thing deep in their bones. The storm had not been only a storm. Something else had been there, something that had looked back at them from the white. When word of the tragedy reached beyond the valley, investigators were sent from the cities. They arrived weeks later, their sleds heavy with instruments and notebooks, their faces flushed with confidence that they could bring reason to what had become legend. They walked through the village with polite smiles, asking questions, taking notes, never quite meeting the eyes of the locals. To them, it was another case of human error in unforgiving conditions. The mountains were cruel, storms unpredictable. Surely there was nothing more than that. The first theory was the simplest, hypothermia. The cold alone, they argued, was enough to unravel the human mind. They explained how body temperatures drop, how judgment weakens, how people can hallucinate in the final stages. The stripping of clothes, they said, was paradoxical undressing. The strange movements, the footprints leading away from shelter, those too could be explained by confusion. In their reports, they used words like disorientation, exposure, panic. On paper, the theory fit. To officials, it was tidy. To the families, it was insulting. Panic and confusion did not break ribs without force. It did not carve spirals into ice. It did not drag bodies into trees. Another theory pointed to an avalanche. The searchers themselves dismissed this at once, but still the investigators recorded it. Avalanches can strike without warning, they wrote. The sound and force of collapsing snow could drive people to flee their tents, their shelters, into the storm itself. Yet when they walked the ridges, there was no evidence of slides, no broken trees, no great scars carved into the mountain. The snow had fallen, yes, but it had not moved in that way. Still, the officials kept it in their notes. Easier to write of falling snow than of unseen hands. The next theory looked inward. Psychological breakdown. Groups, they argued, collapse under pressure. Hunger, cold, and fear can twist people into dangers to one another. Perhaps the travelers turned violent. Perhaps their injuries came not from nature, but from each other. The sharpened branch, the bruises on the arms, these could be signs of fighting. Yet this too crumbled under scrutiny. If they had fought, where was the blood? Where were the weapons? Where were the tracks of struggle? Instead of answers, the questions multiplied. There were more unsettling theories whispered, though not written in the official reports. Searchers who had spoken of strange footprints. Investigators dismissed them as distortions. Snow shifts. Shapes change. But the villagers remembered the width, the depth, the unnatural length of those prints. Some swore they had seen them before in winters past, far from where people should have been. They spoke of tall figures that stood at a distance when the storm was thick, pale shapes against the white, gone when approached. Spirits, they said, old things that dwelled in the snow, waiting for the desperate to wander too far. The investigators laughed at such tales, but laughter does not erase memory. Others whispered of curses. The mountain was old, older than any settlement, older than the families that claimed to know it. There were places even hunters did not enter, clearings where the snow lay strange, where silence pressed too heavily. Some believed the travelers had crossed such a place, had angered whatever lingered there. It explained, they said, why the storm had struck so suddenly, why the snow itself seemed to fall harder around the bodies, as if burying the evidence. Officials ignored such words, but the villagers lowered their voices when speaking them, as if the very snow outside might be listening. Conspiracies also grew. Some argued that the truth was known but hidden. The investigators had seen what the villagers saw, but they buried it beneath reports and tidy language. Why? Perhaps to prevent panic. Perhaps because what they found did not fit into reason. Rumors spread of missing pages in the journals, of photographs that were taken but never shared, of artifacts removed from the site and never returned. Some swore that a man from the team left the valley before the others, pale-faced, refusing to speak. His notes burned in the stove of his cabin. The dogs, too, became part of the theories. Their behavior was recorded in no official account, yet those who witnessed it never forgot. Animals sense what humans cannot, they said. If the dogs cowered, if they growled at empty corners, then perhaps the travelers had not only fought the storm. Perhaps something else had walked beside them, unseen but not unfelt. There were also those who argued the land itself was to blame, that the valley and the pass were places of thin air, not only in breath but in meaning. Thin between worlds, some said. Places where reality bent, where things crossed over. The symbols carved in the snow, were they madness or were they messages scratched by hands no longer human? The villagers did not answer such questions. They only kept their fires burning longer that year, watching the windows, listening to the silence. In the end, the reports were closed. The tragedy was marked as exposure, as hypothermia, as the price of arrogance against the mountain. The files were stored away in cabinets in cities far from the valley. But the people who lived with the mountain knew better. They knew the cold can kill, yes, but not like this. Not with bruises that looked like grasping hands, not with eyes frozen wide in terror, not with laughter carried on the wind when no one was there. So the theories remained. Natural, supernatural, conspiratorial, layer upon layer, none strong enough to cover the truth. The tragedy lingered, not solved but buried, like the bodies themselves beneath the snow. And every winter since, when storms rolled down from the mountains, When the past disappears into white, the valley remembers. They look to the ridges and ask themselves the same question. Was it the storm, or something that walked within it? Time has a way of softening most tragedies. Years pass, seasons change, and memory grows thin, yet there are certain events that remain sharp, even when decades stand between the present and the past. The tragedy in the valley is one of them. Though the names of the lost have faded, though the cabins they once slept in have collapsed under moss and rot, the story itself still breathes. It does not fade because it does not belong only to those who died. It belongs to the mountain, to the snow, to the silence that waits every winter for someone else to stumble too far into its grasp. The villagers who stayed behind carried the memory like a second skin. They taught their children to fear the snow not as a natural hazard, but as something more, something alive in its stillness. To outsiders, the warning sounded like superstition, another tale from a place cut off from the world. But those who had seen the bodies, those who had stood in the storm and heard voices when no one was near, knew the warnings were not stories. They were survival. Generations passed, yet the unease never lifted. Some winters were worse than others. Some storms rose so sudden, so heavy, that even the oldest among them whispered of the night when the travelers disappeared. Each time the wind rattled the shutters, each time the fire guttered low, they remembered. The valley did not let go. Memory became ritual. People placed charms above their doors. They kept fires burning through the night even when wood was scarce. They whispered prayers not to the God of their churches but to the mountain itself, as if begging it to pass over them, to let them see spring again. But what unsettles most is not only the tragedy itself. It is the lack of resolution. If the storm had been the only culprit, it would have been easier to accept. The storm is merciless, but it is understandable. It crushes, it freezes, it buries. It does not confuse. It does not leave symbols carved into the snow. It does not drag bodies into trees. Yet no explanation has ever filled the gaps. Not science, not superstition, not conspiracy. All have been spoken, and still the silence remains heavier than the words. There is something unbearable about an unanswered question. Human beings can endure suffering if they understand its cause, can mourn if they know what to mourn. But when death comes without reason, when it arrives with marks that defy comprehension, it breeds more than grief. It breeds paranoia, fear without shape. That is what the valley inherited. Not only the memory of death, but the knowledge that they may never know why it happened. Perhaps the truth lies buried under the snow, with the bodies never recovered. Perhaps the mountain holds the answers, frozen deep in ice, preserved in silence. Or perhaps the truth is not meant to be uncovered at all. Some say the land remembers what people cannot, and that the snow keeps secrets because to reveal them would shatter the fragile order we call reason. Others believe the story was never about the travelers at all, but about the land itself, reminding those who live there of their place. That human beings are guests in winter's house, and that sometimes the house decides to lock the doors. It is tempting to think such things cannot happen now, that modern tools and modern knowledge can protect us. But every winter people still vanish. Hikers lost in storms, drivers found frozen in their cars, small communities cut off until they re-emerge with stories of strange lights, of shadows moving against the snow. Some return alive, whispering of things they will not put into words. Others return only in spring when the thaw uncovers them, and some never return at all. The tragedy of the valley lingers because it is not finished. It is a reminder that nature is not only indifferent, but perhaps not alone in its silence. That there are places in this world where logic falters, where the cold is more than temperature, where the snow does not merely fall, it watches. On nights when the storm presses against your windows, when the flakes cover the streets in endless white, when the wind rises in a voice too close to human, you may find yourself remembering this story. You may sit by your fire warm and certain, and still wonder if you stepped outside. If you followed the footprints that led into the storm, would you be walking toward emptiness or toward something waiting in the snow? Perhaps the most haunting part of all is not the deaths, nor the silence, nor the symbols left in the drifts. It is the question that remains unanswered. What did they see in their final moments? What froze their faces in terror so deep it survived even in death? Was it madness, hallucination, the storm itself crushing their senses? Or was it something else, something real, something that still walks in white silence, unseen yet watching? The snow keeps its secrets, But every winter, when the world is buried in silence, it offers us a chance to ask the question again. And maybe one day someone will stumble too far into the storm and find the answer. Until then, we are left only with silence, with memory, and with the endless, falling snow. And so the story remains, not closed, not resolved, but open like the mouth of the storm itself. If you found yourself haunted by this tale, if the silence of winter feels different now, then stay with us. Share your thoughts in the comments, let us know what you believe really happened that night, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you awake long after the fire has died. Because the snow is still falling and some mysteries are not finished.